Hey, welcome to the Cam and Otis Show. We're a father-son business podcast where we talk with other lifelong learners about making an impact and solving big problems. And we're lucky enough today to have our good friend Scott Ritzheimer coming back with us. Scott, it is good to see you, man. How you been?
Otis, there's this moment that I have whenever we get here, and I'm like, oh, I hope I was nice because we met when you were on my show and decided we would turn the mics around. And there's this like small dread of like, did I ask really mean questions or something? Am
Right.
I about to pay for
I'm
it?
suckering you in, man. I'm just suckering you in. Here it comes. Here it comes. Just jab, 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 right hook.
Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. So I'm great. Excited to be here. This is going to be a great conversation.
Oh yeah, man. And I am just dying to know. You spend all that time building that huge. I'm going to call it huge church that was super successful. But a church is a nonprofit, and you took off the nonprofit cloak. I don't know why I said cloak and not hat, but you did, whichever it was, the hat or the cloak, and then you went into business, which is all about the profit. What was that mindset like in that shift?
Yeah, so it's a fascinating thing, and where the church you're talking about it was actually a company. It's called Start Church. Now we worked hand in hand with churches. We helped launch. At one point, it was 7 of the 10 fastest growing churches in the country, and during my time there, it was about 15,000 churches, and then some other organizations. So it's actually I was at the intersection of nonprofit and for-profit the entire time. We were a for-profit business that basically did nonprofit things with nonprofit organizations and had to deal with the tension of those two worlds constantly. This is a little bit of a peek behind the curtain, but Monday mornings are tough for a lot of pastors, right? Because their primary income day is Sunday. Not that any of them are in it for the income; it'd be a terrible idea. But you need money to run an organization. And so even the part of church we had to deal with was the business part of church, the organizational side of church. And so we were constantly helping the pastors we were working with navigate this reality of organizational life versus spiritual or congregational life, or whatever language you wanted to use for that. And I think, to kind of summarize it, the fascinating thing is organizations are organizations. And when you look at both the business world and the nonprofit world, there are differences, of course, but they are far more similar than they are dissimilar.
I agree with you. I worked for a nonprofit a while back, and I do a lot of volunteer work. And I tell you, and a good friend of mine, I have a good friend of mine, Matt Colvin, who did something very similar to what you did with Start Church, uh, who helps small nonprofits kind of get up and running. And the biggest mistake they all make is they forget about the business side. Would that be in all those experiences? Is that the same of what you've seen?
Yeah, I mean, for sure. So one of the challenges with the nonprofit world is that every single nonprofit faces the same first stage that every for-profit deals with. We call it early struggle, right? It is not fun and roses and, in the church world, salvation's galore. It is a existential fight for survival, right? Like we're just like, can we get this thing off the ground?
Right.
The pastors have, he is caffeinated up to his eyeballs because he's just talking with everyone and everybody who will listen, and it's usually over coffee or a meal, right? So you look at most pastors, they gain about 20 pounds and their caffeine level is up. Their blood pressure is probably up considerably too. I just didn't have that data. So they're going out and they're sharing this with everybody. Same thing in the business world. You're fighting for what makes more sense in the for-profit world. You're fighting for a profitable and sustainable market. That's a really boring phrase, but really important concept. If you're trying to get the thing off the ground, you have to find a profitable, sustainable market. Well, that's about the worst definition for success in a church, right? Like the last thing any pastor ever came to us and said is, hey, how do I find a profitable, sustainable market? But the reality of it is to organize a group of people, to have the resources to meet in a location, right? To have the resources to pay a pastor's salary, even part-time, Money is a component of that. Profit, for lack of a better term, is a component of that. Now, you can call it whatever you want, but the reality of it is that every organization, to get out of that early struggle period, has to be profitable. And to do that, they have to have revenue. Now, the sources of revenue are very different, and the kind of the mechanism of revenue is different. But the reality of it is, you know, depending on the number you get, 6 out of 10, 8 out of 10, 9 out of 10 for-profit organizations will fail. What happens in the nonprofit world is actually worse. What happens in the nonprofit world is many of those organizations get stuck in that early struggle stage permanently. They just live there. We mistake the definition of nonprofit, right, from a state standpoint. It's not even federal language. It's a state term. We mistake that definition for a organizational strategy, and it doesn't work. And so it breaks my heart. And there were so many pastors and ministry leaders and other types of nonprofits that were just constantly struggling for enough resource to barely make ends meet. And the real tragedy in that, yes, it's difficult, but look at the vision that remains unachieved, because all you can do is try to struggle through and get through the next week.
The thing that I think is interesting, you talk about comparing the nonprofit startup, that early phase, to the for-profit. In for-profit, I think for a lot of businesses, especially if you're solving a good problem, not just copying someone else, you got that awareness marketing of trying to get out and just like making sure people are problem aware, and then once they're problem aware, you can bring them towards you. In a church, I could see how that creates an extra layer, because not only do you need the marketing budget, but also the kind of awareness marketing you're going to be doing as a church is going to be giving back to help build up the community, because that's why churches are so successful. And that is to build up that community. How can you, or what does that early phase look like of trying to build that up when you don't have the capital? Because I have a feeling there's a lesson there that you can put into entrepreneurship.
There sure is. So it's really interesting. Churches are a unique subcategory of nonprofits. So I'm going to come back to them in a second. But you're right. The problem is this: it's that your funding source and your value creation source recipients are divorced in a nonprofit. You are not making money from the people you're providing value to. Mm-hmm. That can be seen as, and to an extent, is a new layer of complexity. And complexity is a killer for a brand new venture. However, it's actually a ridiculous advantage to getting the organization off the ground, because you don't have to provide value every time you generate revenue. It's a lot more like venture capital, right, than it is like your mom and pop, dry cleaner or restaurant down the road. And so when nonprofits get hold of this, when they get over the fact that, to be a nonprofit is to be poor, or to ask for handouts, or, no one says it like that, but the mind games that are there, they can actually get out of that early struggle period faster than a for-profit can, if they have the willingness to, and it's a hard thing to do, but if they have the willingness to ruthlessly pursue revenue. Right? To go out and find people who will invest in the cause that you're pouring into. And you have to do that first. Most nonprofits try and do it the other way around. They try and fumble through until they have something to show for it, and then they go and raise money. And to an extent, that's true, right? You can't go and ask, the XYZ Foundation for $10 million before you've done anything or have any idea what to do. So there's a little bit of a reciprocation that happens. It's a little chicken and egg. But the reality of it is, in this case, the chicken comes first, right? The revenue comes first. And if you can go out and just focus on raising revenue, casting the vision to those who can support financially, it's way easier to solve the value problem when you have money. And it's a virtuous cycle. So a real quick thing on churches. Churches are a little different because most of their revenue comes from participants, right? From members, from people who show up on Sunday. And most of those members, the average across the US, now this might be a little dated at this point, it was getting longer last time I looked at it, but it was about 9 months from the time someone started attending till someone started to donate regularly to their church. And across the US,
that's a whole lot of free.
That's a lot of free church, salvations, right? And getting your family and life right. Yeah, there's a whole lot of transformation that can happen in 9 months. And so, but it's the same kind of thing. You have to recognize as a pastor, forgive me for this, butts and seats doesn't solve your problem in the beginning, right? Because there's such a big delay, and the expenses are not delayed by 9 months, right? You got to have extra, goldfish crackers, they don't pay for themselves, right? The nursery, we need food, otherwise there will be a riot. And so there is this whole load of front-ended expenses, and quite honestly, the best chances of success in the church planning world were to there's several different models for this, but we're to partner up with an existing organization, denomination, church planting network, someone who had the resources to foot the bill ahead of time for you. There's a couple really brilliant and beautiful ones out there. There's also this really cool idea where existing churches will adopt new startups as well, which is just a fascinating model. So it's not the only way. I'm not even going to say it's the best way. I'm just going to say the mechanics of that are really helpful because they solve that financial need early while the church gets moving in the right direction.
Which leads to something I'm curious about it, as since you worked with churches so much, because I've seen it in other nonprofits, is this competition. And it's a pet peeve of mine. I'm going to try not to get up on my soapbox and start throwing down the brim and firestone, because it pisses me off. But I mean, in the end, right? I mean, as a church, whether it's Islamic, Jewish, Christian, or any other faith, your idea is to convert people to that faith. And just like nonprofits, nonprofits, they're formed to solve a problem, and there can be multiple nonprofits who want to solve that problem. I've run across several nonprofits that look at other nonprofits that are working in the same space as competitors, and even use the term that's a conflict of interest when there was an overlap of maybe a representative of one at a meeting with a representative of another. And does that go on in churches?
It goes on everywhere. I mean, that's a human thing. The mechanics of it, to have a little grace on it, one of the things that makes it difficult organizationally, right, mechanically, not even talking about the spiritual or human side of things, is that there's no ownership in a nonprofit. And that's a good thing. It should stay that way. I'm not saying that should change, but it makes things like this hard. Because when businesses merge or partner together, there are dollars and cents that are attributed that directly align with, or the hope is that they directly align with the value that each is bringing to the table. And so it's a little easier to measure when someone's not holding up their end of the deal. It's a little easier to measure whether or not it's worth it for us to do things together. And so, there's no such thing as a merger. There's always an acquisition. And that's a little clearer in the business world. In the nonprofit world, because no one gets a payout, right? Nobody divests their interest. It's much harder to quantify. It's much harder to externalize that conversation. And so it just makes for a messier situation. Doesn't make it right. Doesn't mean that we should be competing with each other, but it does make it messier. The other part of the issue is that there are very, very different ways of doing things. And so I would say this affects the church a little bit more, in that, everyone has a different style of worship. Everyone has a different set of doctrines. Everyone has, there's different religions. There are some what are perceived as fundamental differences. I think we major on minors far too often. And then I think we get on each other about minoring on major. It gets to be a messy thing, right? So I can have a little bit more compassion, because seeing inside of those situations, it's not naturally as easy, and we put greater pressure on them to somehow say, like, they should be above that or beyond that. And the reality of it is, they're people, right? Our pastors on Monday morning, right? We dealt with some really, really irate people. Had nothing to do with our service sometimes, right? Had everything to do with they're just in a tough situation. So if we kind of, loop in a previous thought, you have these under-resourced nonprofits, not because there's not enough resources out there, but because they've got a wrong mindset around it. Well, under-resourced people are always going to view the world competitively, because they're coming from an either overtly stated or undercurrent of scarcity. And so I think it has a lot more to do with the water that we're swimming in, right? And just the murkiness of a lot of those transactions than anything else.
I'd be really curious, talking about, nonprofits, church, and then, stepping into business as well. Dad, you said in the intro, we're talking about making an impact, solving big problems, those type of things. Where do you see you can, in the royal sense, you can exert the most force to solve that problem? Because, the stat that comes to mind, and you probably might actually know this stat better than me because I heard it a long time ago, but it's, when you take a dollar to all these different organizations, how much actually gets out into the community. I think churches were like 70 cents on the dollar, which is like way better than government. I think government was like 25 cents on the dollar. Nonprofits, I don't know the stat on. For-profits, of course, it's a very different set of math there. But all in all, these are all different mechanisms that you can use to address really the same problems in a lot of ways. So in your experience, what have you seen as the most effective tool?
Yeah, I don't know that exists. I think that each one has its most effective role, right? And if I were to throw any under the bus, I would say government and insurance are probably the two least effective. Like those, I don't have a very high esteem for either of those, mechanically speaking, because they tend to be so inflationary. So, but what I would say is that getting each of these types of organizations with each of their roles to this stage that we call predictable success, that's where it's most efficient. And when you look at organizations that that score poorly on metrics like that, they tend to be in a suboptimal stage. They tend to be the brand new startup, right? You look at a brand new startup, 90% of their income as an organization will go to revenue for the senior pastor. And it's probably a quarter of what they should be making if they were working in a regular salary. So they're woefully inefficient in that early stage when it comes to resource usage. Very, very effective, right? They're doing something with nothing, quite literally. But as a system, that is a terribly inefficient system. They have to spend so much time on pursuing resources and then squeezing the last bit out of those resources. It's woefully inefficient. Very effective, very inefficient. As they progress, they move into this fun stage. It's kind of it's the nonprofit and for-profit version of, your mom and pop shop, downtown. Like they're profitable, they're doing great, it's relatively simple. They're employing a number of people. They're engaged in their community. It's wonderful. That's probably second most effective stage. Now, what happens is when you do that, you do it well, you grow. I mean, that's just when you do things well, you grow. That's not that simple, but it's almost that simple until it becomes really complex. And so what happens is we start to graduate up out of that second stage. By the way, the name of the second stage is fun. It's just because it's fun to lead an organization there. It's fun to run a business and fun. It's fun to grow. And you'll see this in the church world. You'll see it in the nonprofit world. You see it in the business world. They'll have double, triple, quadruple digit growth during these stages. And one of the biggest reasons why folks still advocate church planting in particular, when it's like there are enough churches, everyone's like, can we just agree? Like we have enough. The reason why is a stage thing, and it's because during that fun stage is where about 90% of the salvations, life transformations, whatever you want to, language you want to call that, a significant amount of the impact comes during that time. Because the organization in the church world, it makes sense to use this, is very evangelistic, right? We've got a good thing going, come be part of it. It's the same thing happens in the business world. We've got this cool business. We're stealing victory from the jaws of defeat. We're taking business from these much bigger competitors. It's fun to work in these organizations. It's fun to work with these organizations. And so again, a very effective time, but the problem with it is, have you guys ever seen 6-year-olds play soccer?
Yes, I coach 5-year-olds in rugby.
So okay. So if you look at the way that these organizations are run, it's like a group of 5-year-olds playing soccer, right? It's all hands on deck all the time. We got a problem in the front of house. Everyone's in the front of house. We're going to fix it. We got a problem in the back of house. Everyone's in the back of house. We're going to fix it. And it's all hands on deck all the time. And while that's fun kind of in the moment, it's really heroic. I don't know if did you see the movie Pets? when the little rabbit kind of saves the day at the end. He's like, I'm wet, he's like, I'm tired, I'm wet, but I look good. That's kind of how we are as leaders in these fun organizations. But what happens, again, kind of going through the arc of this, is all that success leads to more complexity. We used to have 5 people. Now we have 50, right? We used to have, 15 members in my living room. Now we've got 500 members in a rented auditorium. All the dials have turned up. My business used to be me in my basement bedroom. Now it's me in this office with 32 other people. And so as that complexity dials up, we enter the teenage years of being an organization. Our feet are a little too big for the rest of us. We start tripping over ourselves. We start making mistakes. It's complexity that's causing us to cause problems. And we enter in, this is all going back to your answer here, we enter into this woefully inefficient stage as an organization because, again, we start directing all these resources to solving the problems that are happening inside the organization as opposed to being able to affect change outside of the organization. Now, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, so I was just going to ask. I have this thought that I found years ago that I seems to usually ring true, which is that people will hate on government, hate on business, hate on these different things, and that usually the thing they're hating on is a factor of scale more so than it is the thing itself. And is that kind of what you're getting at there? That it's almost like you need more of the smaller stage rather than the one big church, the one big corporation trying to run everything. Is that what you're getting at?
So, and it's not even necessarily an issue of size, right? It's an issue of stage. Now, stage and size they can be proxies of each other, right? We can assume that anytime you get up over 150 employees, you have this gravitational pull toward these later stages. So let me just go through stages real quick. So early struggle, trying to get the thing off the ground. Fun stage, we got it off the ground. We're hurtling through the atmosphere. It's a lot of fun. We can do no wrong. We deliver in the 11th hour. It's awesome. We do that until we stop delivering in the 11th hour. And now it's like we missed the day and it's the next day and then it's a little longer. And we kind of attribute that to just taking big risks and occasionally you'll miss one. And then we realize, no, this is systemic. We have something wrong. What that organization has to do is they have to wholesale invest into systems and processes as a way of doing business, as a way of doing church, as a way of doing X, not just a tool, an actual way of thinking, making decisions and doing it. So that's important because when you add that to that entrepreneurial flavor and zeal that the organization had from its early days, you get this beautiful mixture of both. That's what creates predictable success. That's where whatever that thing is, governmental unit, nonprofit, local church, business, that's where it's at its best. It's in predictable success. It's at its peak stage for its ability to scale, not necessarily whether it has scaled at some point in time. Does that make sense? Now, we tip off on the other side of this, and this is where things like government get a really bad rap, and rightfully so, is because how did we get out of whitewater? System and process. So how do we solve new challenges that come up in predictable success? Well, we increasingly lean towards system and process. That got us out of this real difficult. It's probably what we need to do again. And the organization goes on and it ages and it gets a little arthritic. It starts to get over processed for the very first time. We start to lose our effectiveness as an organization for the sake of efficiency, quite honestly. And it moves into treadmill. And it's these very large treadmill organizations that they have giant brands. They're well recognized. It's the church on the corner that's been there for 100 years. Like we all know it. We all see it. They're overly visible, right? And so they start to define the narrative. They start to have sway on the entire industry that they're in. What's at stake here is what's the role of vision for our future? Is our goal to continue using the vision of the past, or is it our goal to come up with a vision for the future of the organization, the industry, whatever it may be? And what happens is, eventually and inevitably, the vision gets snuffed out. We're satisfied with maintaining the vision that was set 10, 20, 50, 500 years ago, and we have no capacity to create new vision and actually go after it. And the organization falls into the big rut. This is major educational institutions. It's your local DMV. It's, J.C. Penney, maybe not, but it's the, name one that was there a while ago and is, barely there now. And so we've got these very, very large, though, with a history of success, giant brand recognition, right? But they're in the big rut. They've lost their ability to innovate. They talk about innovation all the time, but they're not really making any change. And again, we fall back into an ever increasing inward looking focus, right? We're rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. It's not helping things, right? But we feel busy, we feel productive. And that's where organizations that are in that big rut stage become less and less effective, less and less efficient, until ultimately they cease to exist for one reason or another. They're sold, bought out, they close the doors, whatever it may happen. They move into death rattle, and that's it. And so to answer your question, is a ridiculously long answer. I'm sorry, but
very good answer though. Don't worry.
Answer your question. It's about the stage, right? Now that's the stage for individual organizations, but it's also the stage for industries and institutions, right? And so when you look at a lot of what's going on, we'll go back to the church for a direct example of this. Much of the church is in the big rut. There's a story actually from a church in Texas. They called in a consultant and they're like, hey, we need help. We've been losing members. Our membership is declining at the death rate in our organization, right? Like our average age is, 65 years old. And so they call in this consultant and they come and help us. We've been successful for decades, but something's going on. We need help. Comes in, interviews everybody, does this thing. And the board gets together and they bring him in. They say, okay, tell us what you found. What should we do? And he said, well, you should put a fence around the outside. At the gate, you should charge admission for how church was done 50 years ago. And so a lot of what we picture, as the church globally, right, or we'll say here in the U.S. nationally, is the big rut version of the church. It's not those 15,000, church plants that we did. It's not those, 7 fastest growing, but because there's so many of them and because they're on, virtually every street corner downtown, they have an overwhelming ability to define what that is. And it also creates a gravitational pull in the industry, in the segment. So when you start a church, you work, you hustle, you get through those early stages. There's this almost instant gravitational pull toward those later stages, toward the predictable side of predictable success. And it comes at the cost of vision and future success.
I'm in this discussion, what's been rolling around in my head, because and thanks for pointing this out too, because the church is a unique nonprofit. They're not the same as one of the veteran nonprofits that I work with because of how they get their money, how they serve, and all those sort of things. What's an unexpected lesson from that type, working with that type of an organization, that you find yourself utilizing, helping, in your new well, not that new, but your focus in helping businesses have that predictable success?
What churches do really well, and I would give credit to nonprofits as a whole for this one, I think they're very similar, is that they get the mission, vision, value side of things, right? They get what we call synergy, right? This kind of teamwork and valuation. Now, to a fault sometimes, but the business world could use a lot more of that. One of the things that is just unbelievable is how much work a church can get done in a weekend with how few employees. Right? When you look at the average size and complexity of a church, they will run at 10x the complexity of another organization that's the same size with about 1/100th of the employees. And so they do it through volunteer work, and the most effective organizations actually push their volunteers quite hard, not because they're abusive or abrasive, but because they're accomplishing something together.
Right.
And so the thing that's carried me is the ability to motivate when revenue is not a factor, right? Daniel Pink did great work on this, but the ability to motivate when money's not a factor. And, it's not that it's not a factor, but it's not the factor. It's not the default, let's just pay people more to get them to stay longer. Let's just pay people more to get them to come work for us. That's not in the repertoire of most nonprofits. It's certainly not in the repertoire of most churches. They've got to come up with better ways, and they do that through culture. And so when it comes to culture, creativity, getting a lot done with a very few number of people, churches have most businesses beat handily.
You hinted at this already, but the mission, the value to a fault. That was one thing early on in this I thought that I would love to hear your perspective on, which is the burnout inside of nonprofits. I think it's the similarities to startup burnout. I think are really obvious. That it's look, we're all in this together. It's a small group. We're trying to push towards this big, amazing goal that gets everybody excited. The difference is in the startup world, at least you have the carrot of getting a portion of the company, getting extra money, whatever it is down the road. In nonprofits, you don't get that side of it. You don't get that carrot. And then you add in that it is largely an underpaid sector. And so you get this burnout that doesn't really have that compensation. What do you think, or I guess, how can you balance the value of the mission and the values without pushing into that burnout stage? Like, what kind of awareness does that look like?
Yeah, I'm going to sound like a broken record here. It has more to do with the stage that they're in than it does the issue of mission, vision, values, because that does happen. But when you look at it systemically and holistically, it goes back to something we talked about earlier, and that is that nonprofits will systemically and long-term be stuck in early struggle. And so it's not that it's a nonprofit as much as it is that it is a nonprofit that's still in early struggle. And so any organization, you try and run a business in early struggle for 15 years, and you're going to have just brutal burnout. It's almost not possible, right? Because the profit, you'd leave by then. So one of the helpful things about profit is it's an indicator when something's not working, and we pay closer attention to it in the business world than we do in the nonprofit world. So what happens in those difficult stages, early struggle, whitewater stage, treadmill stage, one of the earliest issues that comes up, or most persistent or scariest issues, is that profitability tends to slide in all of those areas, right? Mm-hmm. We're not profitable in the beginning because we don't have any revenue. We're not profitable in whitewater because we're screwing up all the time and complexity is crushing us. We start to lose profitability in treadmill because we lose market share in our edge, or we take some big risks and they don't work out. And what happens in the business world is we key in on that, and it's like, okay, that's a problem that has to be solved. We don't understand why or how, and even in the business world, that can take several years to do. But in the nonprofit world, we don't have the same appreciation for profit as a metric, right? As a dashboard indicator. And so we'll run our profit issues at red for longer. The problem with profit isn't actually the main issue. It's just a symptom. But what is the problem is being in those difficult stages in early struggle, whitewater, treadmill for the long term is going to chew up and spit anybody out, even the most resilient people. And so to wrap it up, I would say the problem is that nonprofits tend to be more okay with those difficult stages than for-profits are, which makes them more susceptible to an internal environment that causes churn and burnout at a faster rate.
Well, and I think that's a true testament to what you said about what nonprofits and churches tend to have is that mission, vision, and value. Because if the team is bought into the mission, vision, and values of the organization, whether it's for-profit or nonprofit, they are going to go all in. I don't care whether you're making a widget or you're saving people for Jesus. It doesn't matter. If people have bought in to that belief, they're going to bust their butt. Military, very similar thing, right? What guys and gals do in the military is just that. They've bought into the mission, vision, and values of what they're there to do, and that's serve. In that sense, how have you been able to? Quite literally, maybe even. I might do it, but I don't know. You're a lot nicer than me. Grab that CEO by the scruff of the shirt, the lapels of the sport coat, and shake them and sit them down and get them to start thinking about mission, vision, and values. In your current role with Scale Architects, and how y'all focus on these guys like that.
Yeah, interestingly, my clients kind of self-select, because of my background and who I speak to. I tend to have very, very even faith-forward businesses that come to me. So most of my world tends to, to have an idea of the value of mission, vision, values, and so. My biggest thing is not necessarily taking them by the shirt to get them to do that. The bigger problem that I have is they have them and they're either not real, or even in the best case scenario, they have them and they're not connected to what they actually do. So, and that's a really big deal, because most of the clients that I work with, both churches, nonprofits, and for-profits, are in the whitewater stage. That's where I spend most of my time. I'm one of the weird people out there who's designed for those waters, right? It's not a comfortable time, but for whatever reason, it's where I call home, and I get people out of there as quickly as we can. And almost always what's happening is the natural alignment that we had as a small team, where, we were aligned because of the founder was the vision, right? Like it was by osmosis. It oozed out of them. You couldn't, it was like trying to fly by the sun, it's like you couldn't help but get, at least heated up a little bit. It's just there. It's natural. Well, when you get these organizations that are big enough to have the complexity that causes whitewater, not everyone has contact with the founder anymore. Maybe not even the top team. And so you have to move from this passionate, kind of, let's go, kind of rah, like in the moment every time, flock ball, to intentionally structuring what you intuitively did in fun, right? In that whitewater, we actually have to look at how do we intentionally link our mission, vision, values to our goals. Are we actually setting goals that are moving us toward our mission, vision, values? It's shocking to me, but 9 times out of 10, no. Like there is some goal that is wildly out in left field, if not more than one. And then have we implemented strategies as an organization, things that we're doing, month in, month out, the markets that we've selected, the way we reach those markets, are those in line with our goals? Are they in line with our mission, vision, values? And so you have to start stacking these different layers, because otherwise we say our value is innovation, right? Go be a truck driver. Well, what in the world does that mean? We take this super, super ethereal, and innovation's a terrible value, by the way. It's a super weird, abstract idea. And then we put someone in this super concrete, role, and we tell them to like be something different. Like there's no connection. And even on our best day, we can barely grab hold of those two worlds, right? As executives who've had 6 months to hash out and wordsmith, our Dunder Mifflin version of our purpose statement. And then we expect everyone else to get it because we had a raw meeting 6 months ago, right? Where we kind of vomited out this new mission, vision, values on everybody. It doesn't work that way. It could work that way whenever there were 5 of you, but now that there's 50 or 500 or 5,000, we've actually got to sit down and work this out. And that's the job of leadership. The job of leadership is to link those together. It's not the job of the front line.
I think there's an interesting piece there of being able to communicate that mission and the vision down to that lower level. I think of a rugby example, which I'm sure we've talked about before, Dad, but it's like when you talk about playing the game of rugby, if you want to motivate a bunch of people, you don't say, okay, everyone go score. Because if you're thinking about scoring, we call it white line fever, you're not going to actually go score because you're going to make a lot of mistakes. The best coaches are the ones who get you to value the other things. Dad, I don't have the shirt on underneath this, but the relish the ruck, right? All you want to do is hit the ruck, do the dirty work, all those kind of things. And if you focus on that, then the tries come later. And I think that's a big thing when you start talking about it in the business world as well, that it's like, okay, hey, I'm sitting here cutting clips for social media. How does this contribute to innovation? What am I innovating right now? And when you have that gap, it can, it creates that, creates a gap that you can lose a lot of that connection there. What I'm curious about is maybe give me a rule of thumb a little bit of how to balance that abstract with the very, very real. Because as much as, innovation is not a great value there because it doesn't have any connection to your everyday life. If my connection to everyday life is too small, then it's not really much of a vision. It's more like an operations guide.
Yeah, and what happens is we see them as a choice between one or the other, right? That's typically what we're left with. If we don't do the work of connecting the two, we are left with an unsolvable dichotomy. It's either we're thinking about 10 years from now or 10 minutes from now, and the whole rest of it is just choose your own ending, right? And so that again that works with a small organization because we only have 5 different endings available, and they're all close enough that they bump into each other, and we kind of all move in the same direction. It doesn't work in these larger organizations because there's just too much opportunity to run in different directions. And so I would say that it isn't so much a choice between one or the other. It's how do we link the two together? Mm-hmm. And we have to do that structurally. And that shows up in every way from how do you define the levels of leadership inside your organization and their responsibilities as it relates to linking goals to actions. And have you actually sat down and mapped out what that looks like? So we have a hierarchy. We call it the alignment pyramid, but the very base of it, if you could imagine, is mission, vision, values. And those are set by the founder, maybe the board of directors, senior leadership, and they're nothing in and of themselves, right? Like we can have mission, vision, and our nonprofits are guilty of this. We just kind of throw it out there as if it exists, right? If you dream it, they will come. We're not even building it anymore. We're just dreaming it. All us millennial nonprofits, especially. So if you dream it, it will come. Doesn't work. So what's the next step? Well, the next step is, again, like we mentioned earlier, to set goals that will drive us to those. Now, the common misconception is we set goals for what we need to do this year, right? What do we want to sell this year? What's our revenue goal? What we actually need to do is set goals that are milestones to our vision. And that's the first step in linking them together. So now our goals are the first material outworking of who we are as an organization. They're now a visual and pragmatic symbol of, are we going after a mission together? Next level up is strategies, right? What are the strategies that are necessary to achieve those goals? And do they align with the goals and the mission, vision, values? What you tend to find in businesses that are in Whitewater and to the nth degree in nonprofits that are in Whitewater is their strategies are everywhere, right? And mission creep galore, right? Product galore. Like we do everything and then we get bored with it. So we hand it off to someone and they keep doing it into perpetuity. So somewhere between 50 and 80% of what any organization is doing in Whitewater is out of alignment with what they need to do to achieve their mission, vision, values. It's astronomical, and it's closer to the 80% in nonprofits. I was working with a nonprofit, and they had 37 different ministries. They had 50 staff. We cut that down to 6, right? And they grew 5x in the next 3 years, I think. So you've got to see, are our strategies actually just moving us toward our goals? Or are we doing them because we did them in the past and we think that we always have to do them? And then from there, tactically, what do we do as team members, right? Each and every day, like what do we have to consistently do to make these strategies happen? And then finally, actions. What do you pick up the phone when someone's calling, or do you answer the door for the person who just walked in, right? Do you send the email with the typos because you said it was going to be at this certain time, or do you wait until it's perfect? Like real decisions that need to be made. And you can't make those momentary decisions if the next piece of context you have for those is this super ethereal mission, vision, values. But it's a lot easier to make the right decisions and to do that consistently over time in the right direction when it goes up to a super practical set of tactics that are in line with what we want to do as an organization.
What would you say is your sweet spot type of business with Scale Architect? I mean, we've talked about the Whitewater, we've talked about teenage and
it's all the same thing. Yeah. So it's that Whitewater stage. So what does that look like? Nonprofit, for-profit, doesn't matter. Usually happens. There are tremors of Whitewater. There are little like seasons of Whitewater that happen earlier, usually around 5 to 10 employees, around 25 employees, but they tend to be relatively simple solutions, even though they feel really big when they happen. Well, when I'm talking about Whitewater, capital W Whitewater, it usually takes around 45 employees or the equivalent of that. Again, in a church, you got to choose the way you're going to calculate volunteers, but you got enough people that they don't fit around the dining room table anymore, right? It's hard to get a room that they all fit in. That's a new level of complexity. And it's at that point that yeah, we hit those teenage years. We ways that folks have described it. A leader was like, we used to feel like we had a crystal ball. Now it feels a little muddy. It's not quite there. Another one said, my team is unreal. Like up until about 6 months ago, like we were just knocking it out of the park again and again and again. And now it seems like we can't get anything right. Another one said, used to have a feel for the organization. I just knew when I could push the gas and when I had to ease up and where to drive harder and where to hold up a little bit. Now it feels like I'm leading with oven mitts on. I can't quite feel the reins. And so one of the things that's helpful about the stages from a business development standpoint is it gives language to something that's really, really hard to describe. If you're in whitewater and you don't know that that's a stage that every successful organization goes through, you feel like you just suck, right? Like you feel like you're just, we're just, how did we get so dumb? Like, why are we making these mistakes? But when you realize that it's a natural stage that everyone goes through, that's when there's this tremendous freedom to say, okay, what do we want to do about it? Do we want to push forward? Or interestingly enough, do we want to step back to when things were a little simpler, downscale a little bit to where we can become effective again?
One thing that keeps coming to my mind as we talk about, the difference of nonprofit and for-profit is the labor competition aspect. That, if you are the smartest person, you're going to go into finance or you're going to be a doctor because that's where you're going to get paid for your value because you are the smartest person. I know a lot of people who work in nonprofits. My wife is one of them, who is incredibly smart, but they're valuing that mission. They're valuing that at a greater level. But to me, at least, I've always thought that contributes to that burnout because you're asking somebody to, forego literally money, rent, and those type of things in order to make a better impact. What do you think that nonprofits can do to, whether it's literally like organizational change of paying people more, or what else can they do to address that gap? Because, there's countless examples of the smartest people go to jobs where we don't really necessarily need the smartest people, just to insert this real quick, we talk about the smartest people going to finances. There's studies of you can take a monkey throwing darts at a dartboard that can do about as good as the average person trading stocks. Like, we don't need the smartest people there to get slightly better than a monkey. We need those people in nonprofits. We need those people making real impacts. So what can we do to make that change?
Yeah, there's some big questions in there that, if it was something that I could answer in a podcast, we probably wouldn't have to have the podcast. But I think the reality of it is that person who would be motivated for the last nth degree of stocks, even though they may be really smart, that they're not going to commit themselves in the same way to the mission if that's not what they want in the first place. There is ample opportunity to do that right now. And quite honestly, there's a lot of nonprofits where if you're really great at it, you can get paid a lot of money. One position to prove that, college football coaches. They all work for nonprofits, every last one of them. And they make a heck of a lot. So you can make a lot of money if you're really, really good at what you do. You don't have to choose between. The proverb says, see someone who's skilled in their work, they'll always be in demand. They'll always be admired. So if you're in a nonprofit and you're not getting paid well and you're really good at what you do, you might be in the wrong nonprofit, quite honestly, because there's other opportunities. Now, that's not to say that money is the ultimate, decider of the value that you're creating or anything like that. There are a lot of people who will consciously choose to take less pay because of the impact that they can create. And this affects different people in different pay ranges a lot more. But a lot of times when you're looking at the very top of the spectrum, it's a distinction without a difference, right? Once you get over, and the number is always different, but when you get over $100,000 and it's a lifestyle choice, we're not making it or breaking it, right? And so most of those positions now in smaller nonprofits and or not necessarily smaller nonprofits, but in smaller positions, right? Lower paid positions. I think it's a real thing, but more often than not, again, it goes back to the stage. It goes to the, education, there's so much money in education. Why are teachers paid poorly, right? It's big rut thinking. It's because of all the extra layers of compliance and this and that and everything else that's added on to them that prevents them from being as effective. And, the average church is under 75 members. They're chronically in early struggle, maybe just kind of flirting with the fun stage, but they're constantly in this chronic part of early struggle. And so again, what happens especially with nonprofit things is we think, well, the cause is enough, right? Like we can sacrifice being in an optimal stage, right? We can sacrifice making the right business decisions because the cause is enough, and it's not.
Yeah. And man, this has been one of those big think sort of shows. I'm just and amazed at it. Where we've gone with the whole aspect of churches, nonprofits, business, and the alignment. And I think that's just an amazing thing. And for me, what I learned, and you said this pretty early on, and I really like this idea that a nonprofit is more like a VC than a business because of who they're serving. And, we had Pastor Bob on the show a couple of years ago, and I always remember, asking him that sort of question of, the balance between serving the congregation and serving God and serving this and serving that, and how he struggles with that whole thing. So that's a really interesting way of looking at nonprofits. And there's a couple I work with. I think that might just help them get some clarity in that mission, vision, and values, also to make sure that they're following through. So, Camden, how about you? What'd you learn?
Yeah, well, first I want to echo what you're saying. A great conversation. I think I just set a new record for the amount of unanswerable questions I've asked. I think that was 3 or 4. So that is definitely a new record for me. I usually get 1 or 2 in there, but appreciate you playing ball with us, Scott. But amazingly, in that complicated, amazing discussion, I got a fun one. Simple. Scott, you said this little throwaway term of flock ball, talking about those little kids playing soccer, and I am going to get that tattooed on my hand for when I'm going out there coaching rugby this fall, because, it is flock ball. They all just go towards it. My favorite drill with the little kids, Scott, hold up the rugby ball and say, I'm going to go run over there, see who can catch me. And they all run over there. It's the best game ever. But, oh, my gosh, flock ball. Great way to put it.
That's exactly how it works. A thing for me that I learned, it's got to be rugby. It's always, I'm always picking up rugby hints when I'm with you guys, but you can't go for the score. You got to do the down and dirty work. And I mean, that is any organization has such a great mentality that you've got to bring to the table every single day. So yeah, I love it.
Awesome. Scott, how can folks find you? Subscribe to your podcast, learn more about Scale Architects.
Yeah, podcast is The Secrets of the High Demand Coach. Otis was on there a couple months back now. So check that out. I basically went out and found a bunch of my favorite coaches and asked them to give their best advice for free. So it's a great way of finding some great wisdom and advice. And then check us out. We're all over the place. Scale Architects. ScaleArchitects.com. It's all over social media. We've tried to prove the motto wrong that you can't outgive the market. So you'll just find a phenomenal amount of free resources there, and you can get a free copy of the book that lays out everything that we talked about by Les McEwen, my business partner. It's called Predictable Success, but get it there for free on ScaleArchitects.com.
Awesome. Hey, Scott, man, we really appreciate you taking time out of your day to spend with us and share with our audience some great lessons.
It was an absolute pleasure. Thanks, guys.
All right, Camden, run us out.
All right. Thank you all for listening to the Cam and Otis Show. A special thanks to our guest, Scott Ritzheimer, for joining us today. You can follow the Cam and Otis Show on Facebook and Instagram. Full videos are available on our YouTube page. And while you're there, make sure you hit that subscribe button too. If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to pass it along to someone else in your life so they can enjoy it too. And thanks again. We'll see you all next time.